You may be seated. I think that these shirts have brought out the worst in me.
Or maybe the best.
Oh, maybe the best. Oh, okay. The strange thing is, I don't know what came over me to start dancing here, but I have been suffering from vertigo all week, and now I have it back again. So if I fall over during the sermon, just roll me over to the side and continue on. Just hold on to the lectern, yeah. So the question I really have asked for you this morning is how you're doing on your New Year's resolution. I realize you're only 6 days in, but I always think that this is always a great time to start to think about the New Year's resolutions that we actually made as Jews 4 months ago. It's a great opportunity to check in with ourselves to see how are we doing on the big questions in life. Not the frivolity that takes place on New Year's here in America, but of the serious contemplation that we do on our New Year's of Rosh Hashanah. The New Year's resolutions that you make when you're sitting in shul thinking about the most significant issues that face us, not the frivolity and the dancing that takes place maybe after having too many drinks on a New Year's Eve. My father always used to draw attention to the difference between the way Jews celebrate the New Year's and the way the rest of the world celebrates the New Year's. As Jews, we stand before our King of all kings at a solemn time and we take account of our lives. As Americans, we engage in reckless behavior. In fact, things have gotten so out of control in this country that the new head of CNN instructed the on-air talent not to be drinking this year while they were on air. In years past, we have watched. They did. I had no idea you watched CNN. I said I had no idea you watched CNN. That's the one time. Well, at least this year we weren't privy to online piercings as we have been in the past. No more expletives, no more people falling down. And while a more sedate version was displayed on TV and it was a little easier to watch, it didn't stop people from all over the world doing silly things on New Year's Eve. So this is a good time to ask ourselves, really, how are we doing on our Rosh Hashanah resolutions? Because the truth is, there's plenty of time to still get it right. Try again to achieve what we committed to 4 months ago. And if the resolution that we made on Rosh Hashanah now seems silly, or like me, you're an overachiever and you've already accomplished it, I'm just kidding, then now is the time to make a more serious goal or to set another resolution. And I would suggest that you can make a new resolution if you want, no matter how big or little it is. Just make one that you think you can accomplish. Make a resolution this year, just this little one, I suggest, to learn and to grow just a little bit. To learn and to grow into a better version of yourself, because while learning for its own sake is a worthy project, learning so that we can transform ourselves is noble. Learning and growing, changing, becoming who we want to be, not as the world defines us, is an intentional act. And it's the result of hard work, not happenstance. Defining ourselves, calling ourselves to be the best version of ourselves is difficult, and it's not something that everyone can do. And it's the first words of this morning's Parashat that teaches us that incredibly important lesson. Vayechi Yaakov, Jacob lived. Jacob not as he was called earlier, Israel. Vayechi Yaakov be'eretz Mitzrayim, 17 shana, vayehi yemei Yaakov shnei chayav, 7 shanim ve'arba me'ot shana, ve'arba'im me'at shana. Jacob lived 17 years in Egypt. So that's the span of Jacob's life came to 147 years. We have now arrived in this morning's Parashat at the very end of Jacob's life. And even though so much has changed in his life and so much about who he was as a child has changed through the trials and tribulations, through the sibling rivalry, what it means to have been the chosen child, even Jacob didn't even learn that lesson. Even though he learned how to be a husband, albeit not a great one to Leah, and he learned how to live in the balance between Rachel and Leah, and being the father of 12 very different and often filled with conflict children, you would think he would have learned a few more important lessons about life, and that he would have arrived at death's doorstep having learned something. But as Rabbi Chaim Moshe Ibn Attar, the Or HaChaim, points out, this is actually the same old Jacob. Ta'am kriyat shemo Yaakov achar asher amar alav Adonai lo yikra od Yaakov ela Yisrael lo Yaakov yomer od shimcha. The Or HaChaim says that we were told already back in chapter 35, verse 10, that Jacob is no longer going to be called Jacob. From now on, he'll be known as Israel. But we notice that even though that statement is made in the Torah, Jacob is referred to Jacob over and over again. Yes, sometimes he's still referred to as Israel. Even in this morning's Parsha, there is a commotion about Jacob, Israel, Jacob, Israel. But the Or HaChaim points out that why have we at this last moment in Jacob's life referring to him as Jacob and not Israel? The Or HaChaim is teaching us something incredibly powerful. Jacob, I believe, has not changed. Though time after time, circumstance after circumstance, life is teaching him lessons he seems to refuse to learn. Like for many of us, we just don't learn. You know the joke of the old man who drowns. And he goes up to heaven and he asks God, how could you let me drown? I was a man of perfect faith. As the waters rose and a firefighter came by to rescue me from my house, I said to him, you don't need to rescue me. God will save me. And then a rowboat came by and asked him to get on board, and he said, you don't need to save me. God will save me. And then as the waters rise even further, he gets to the top of his house, and a helicopter comes by and says, quickly get aboard. And he says, no, God will save me. I don't even need to give the sermon. You know it already. So he says to God, how could you let that happen? How could you let me die? To which God responded, I sent a firefighter, a rowboat, and a helicopter. Life, the universe, I call it God, teaches us regularly, but we refuse to learn. And Jacob never learned. He is the same person who as a child stole his brother's birthright, as the father who favored one of his children. Let me just show you two more psukim, two more verses from this morning's Parsha. Ve'enei Yisrael kavdu mizokein lo yuchal lirot ve'agesh otam elav vayishak lahem vayichabek lahem. That Israel's eyes were dim in old age, he could not see. So Joseph brought them close to him and he kissed them and embraced them. Jacob, in this verse, is exactly like Isaac was when he was on his deathbed. he couldn't really tell who was who. He couldn't see one from another. He asked Jacob as Isaac had asked Jacob, who are these people? Who are you? You remember the very famous verse, Hakol Kol Yaakov? This sounds like Jacob, but it feels like Esau. That's what his father said. And Jacob in this circumstance asked Joseph, who have you brought before me? I can't see them. It's like he doesn't realize the difference between himself and his father. And he doesn't ever recognize the distance between him and Esau that was the result of a father who blessed him over blessing his brother. He could not realize that the theft of the birthright when his father Isaac was old and couldn't see the result of a lifelong separation from his twin. And one more verse. V'ani natati lecha shekem echad al achecha asher lakachta miyad ha'amori b'charabi uvikashti. And now Jacob says to Joseph, I assign to you one more portion above and beyond your brothers. One more portion of land that I arrested from the Amorites. I'm going to give you a little something extra, he says. As if the last time Jacob had given Joseph a little something extra worked out so well. The Or HaChaim, in his last sentence, makes the most damning comment of Jacob. Litzad shem nafsho hakvu'a bo asher shema Yaakov ki adu midivrehem. The name Israel was an additional name reflecting spiritual highs that Jacob had attained from time to time. The Or HaChaim says, there were moments of elevation for Jacob. There were moments in which he had attained a higher level of spirituality, and in those moments he was referred to as Israel. That's how you know something had changed in him. Yet, the Or HaChaim points out to us, in his last hours, in his last days, in his last breaths, he's referred to as Jacob. He hadn't reached, at the end of his life, a moment of extraordinary spirituality. He hadn't arrived at a full understanding of himself. He hadn't seen any real revelations. He hadn't had real moments of insights in which he could grow and learn, change for the better. So the question that we're left with regards to Jacob and ultimately to ourselves, and that is, do we always attain a level of heightened awareness and then revert back? Doesn't it have to be something different? Can't we find something different? The Or HaChaim says Jacob, looking back at the totality of his life, sees moments in which he had sustained growth. But in the end, he's right back where he came from. Doesn't he realize that this is what happens when you don't work on yourself regularly? The favoritism of the coat of many colors has now become a special inheritance. And we're forced to ask ourselves, why hasn't he learned? Why hasn't he grown? Why has Jacob not learned the lessons of his life? Ki litzad shem nafsho akvu'a bo asher shema Yaakov. Jacob's permanent personality had not changed, says the Or HaChaim. Jacob is the same old Jacob. The only challenge for us in the next year is, are we going to be the same old version of ourselves, or will we have learned the lessons that life is trying so desperately to teach us? When you were younger and you did something wrong, did your parents call you by your full name? In my case, my father always added Michael. J. Michael, he would say. I'm pretty sure that's the only reason why they gave me a middle name. That and official announcements, like when I got another degree, I would be announced as J. Michael Stein. J. Stein, my father used to say, is too fast a name. That's why you'll see whenever I sign anything, I always put the M in, because my father requested that I at least use my middle initial so I would sound a little more serious. We see how that works. However, it was when my father called me by my Hebrew name that I knew it was his most sincere, loving nomenclature for me. His most sincere, genuine moments is when my father called myself Yochanan, because that was the name of his father. See, different names that we have in our lives recall for us different aspects of self. Jacob was Jacob at his low moments, Israel at his height. I have to tell you, there's nothing more elevated for me than when people refer to me as rabbi. It's a seriousness. And it's actually my favorite name outside of Saba and Daddy. Sometimes we get to pick who and by what we are called. And sometimes, no matter how hard we try, that name doesn't stick. Hopefully, what sticks is the name that we want, that we have earned, and that reminds us of the person we long to be. Pick your name carefully, and we'll help support that in your New Year's resolution. Shabbat Shalom. We continue with Musaf, page 184.